As a general rule, one of the things you don't want to come across unexpectedly while digging is a pair of human skeletons. However, this is exactly what happened to a group of French workers as they were laying down a pipeline outside of Avignon in the October of 2003. They notified the police of the remains, which would later turn out to be those of 2 World War I soldiers, and eventually the Commonwealth War Graves Commission set about attempting to identify the soldiers. Besides the human remains themselves, war paraphernalia such as bits of a uniform, ammunition, and a Canadian badge were discovered. However, nothing found stated the soldiers' identities. The Commonwealth War Graves Society worked to ascertain whatever knowledge they could about the soldiers. They were able to approximate their heights and their ages. Research showed that the soldiers were most likely among 16 men who went missing in 1917 in a battle just outside of Avignon. Using information from attestation papers and comparing it to the information they had gained about the soldiers that had been discovered, scientists were able to narrow down the identities of the soldiers, but not to fully identify them. Eventually, the scientists turned to DNA testing using the soldiers' remaining skeletons and teeth. The process of DNA testing was complicated, but it was able to lead them to the descendants of one of the soldiers, and the remains were identified as those of Herbert Peterson. Private Herbert Peterson was born in Scranton, Kansas on December 18, 1895, to Julia and Charles G. Peterson. A little less than 21 years later, in Calgary, Alberta, on February 22, 1916, he enlisted to go to war. On the day of his enlistment, notes were made of everything from his hair color to the 3 small scars on his upper arm, and after a medical examination, he was declared fit to serve as a soldier. He served in the Alberta Regiment of the Canadian Infantry. Prior to going to war, Peterson lived in Berry Creek, Alberta, worked as a farmer, and was a member of the Presbyterian Church. This was a life he would never return to, as he went on to die after just over a year of being a soldier in 1917. Peterson's death was presumed to have taken place during a raid on enemy trenches near Avignon on June 9th of 1917. During said raid, the soldiers were under heavy shell fire, and although at the time it was not confirmed that Peterson was dead, his comrades believed that he had been killed. He was considered missing in action and was commemorated on the Vimy Memorial. By the time Peterson's bones were finally laid to rest, it was April of 2007, a few years after the remains had been discovered and 90 years after Peterson's death. A memorial service took place, and Peterson was buried in La Chaudière Military Cemetery, only a few kilometers from the site of his death. Now, the fact that World War I left soldiers to have their skeletons found decades later made for an interesting story, but aside from human remains, World War I also left a less tangible but much more important mark on the world. Countries were devastated. People who had left home looking for an escape from their everyday lives returned home with permanent injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder, if they returned home at all. Among those countries majorly affected was Canada. The Canadian government was left in debt, and the unemployment rate rose back up once returning soldiers expected their old jobs back. However, Canada was affected in some positive ways too. Women were granted rights as a result of them taking over what were traditionally considered male jobs during the war. Even things like the introduction of income tax, which many people dislike, have lasted until today and are still a part of shaping Canada's identity. However, the biggest change to Canada's identity that World War I caused was the amount of independence that Canada, still a colony of Britain at the time, was granted due to the actions of Canadian soldiers in the Battle of Vimy Ridge. This was a turning point that allowed Canada to be seen as its own nation and treated with a lot more respect, and without this independence, Canadian history wouldn't have been the same.